So.
Okay, gin. What's your favorite gin?
I like anything that has nice imperial overtones to it. So there's a gin called Old Raj, which I quite like. But
Now,
Bombay
imperial
Sapphires.
overtones. I'm not a gin expert, so what does that mean?
Oh,
Gin?
just that if it has this sort of East India Company branding, that's usually a good sign.
I see. Yeah.
It's not a particular quality of the gin itself.
Yeah, I didn't know that was a reference
just,
to a particular way they do the gin.
No, just the sort of references to the British Empire.
Okay, I see. Yeah.
The gin and tonic with the quinine and the tonic was meant to be an anti-malarial treatment. So.
Would you say you're a monarchist at heart, through and through?
No. I mean, I believe in mixed government. So, there's an element of monarchism that should be present in a constitution. But no, I think monarchy, as in the abstract, is not an ideal form of government.
Right. Do you think it's preferable to democracy? Do you think democracy is superior?
Again, it really depends on the mixture of elements. And pretty much any constitution is actually more mixed than pure theory would lead you to think, right? So there are very few absolutely pure direct democracies, and there are very few sort of absolute monarchies of a completely unmixed character that don't have an oligarchic component, for example. Now, if you have a very small setting, a small group of people, maybe a democracy that is very egalitarian can work on the level of something that is even smaller than classical Athens, for example. But I think if you scale up from there, you need to have more of an admixture of different qualities, different human types in order to have a successful polity.
Can you describe just what your daily, work environment is like? What do you do on a daily basis?
Yeah, so day to day, I work at the offices of the Fund for American Studies. And at the Fund for American Studies, I run the Robert Novak Journalism Fellowship Program. This is a program that was established about 25 years ago by Tom Phillips, who was a publishing magnate, with the advice of Robert Novak, the syndicated columnist and a CNN host. And it was a program designed to give about a half dozen young journalists each year the financial support necessary for them to conduct a really in-depth investigation of a subject of their choice. The idea being to find people who are kind of young and up and coming, but who have not yet made their names, and to provide them the resources to write a first book or to do something that will really help them to advance their professional abilities. And so I run that program. On a daily basis, I check in with our fellows. I look at the work they're producing in terms of sort of the research that's going into and the reporting that's going into their year-long projects. And then I also sort of plan events connected with the program, such as we're doing a big dinner in New York City on September 12th. So that's what I do day to day at the Fund for American Studies. And then I'm also editor of Modern Age, which is a quarterly conservative publication published by the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. Modern Age was founded back in 1957 by Russell Kirk. And because it's a quarterly, I'm able to do the editing required for that on a sort of nights and weekends basis. And that I enjoy very much. And then I also do a fair bit of sort of freelance writing and journalism. I'm a columnist for the Spectator USA, for example.
What's the animus behind Modern Age? It's been around for such a long time.
Yeah, I mean, the whole idea is to have something that is presenting the thoughtful side of conservatism, and that is not just sort of a purely scholarly work, but that has a real literary quality to it, and that is actually engaged with the flow of ideas in America today, whether those are political ideas or cultural ideas, aesthetic ideas, philosophical ideas, or other layers. So we try to be very well-rounded, but there is a certain political tilt to it in that it has, a kind of a certain traditionalist conservatism that it's known for.
So you're trying to get kind of that Zen spot, that kind of, you're still approachable to a larger audience, but you're also bringing in that kind of quality, scholarly influenced approach.
Well, that's exactly right. I think it is lamentable that the academy has kind of segregated itself from American life, and that when academics do interact with journalists or with members of the public, they tend to do so on a plane of expertise as opposed to the idea of addressing fellow citizens who are quite intelligent and who are capable of understanding, even if they don't have all the background that a scholar may have, who are nonetheless capable of understanding the fundamental questions that a scholar should be dealing with. So we try to reconstruct that sort of republic of letters, where citizens from different walks of life can engage with one another, if not as equals, then certainly nonetheless with a degree of respect that allows them to meet on a common plane.
Yeah, so you're kind of bringing a high culture mixed with populism. You're bringing something together to have that kind of. I like that. It's a good idea. Is it? Do you find it hard to accomplish in the environment that we're in politically and culturally?
No, I actually find this is a very exciting moment culturally and politically. And because, in some ways, the dominance of the left within our culture is so great, there is a tremendous appetite and a tremendous audience for any kind of serious conservative alternative. And right now you have a lot of sort of new conservative websites and other outlets that have a very sort of immediate political and populist bent to them. But the nice thing about Modern Age, having been around for over 60 years now, is that it's able to do things in a kind of slow and reflective fashion. So it's able to represent even a side of conservatism that right now, when conservatism is actually a very exciting and interesting thing, is still underrepresented. It's something you can't really do on a website, but with a quarterly journal, you can actually go into depth on serious philosophical issues.
And you don't take a real stance probably between this little recent discussion you see somewhat online in the media between national conservatism and the official conservatism of the DC kind of Beltway establishment conservatives. Do you kind of just see? Are you in a different world than that conversation?
No, I wouldn't say I'm in a different world. In fact, with Modern Age, we really try to represent the best in all sides of the conservative movement and to bring them into communication with one another. And that had actually been one of the traditional functions of the journal, much as National Review in its early days had both traditionalists like Brent Bozell and then also fusionists like Frank Meyer and rather Machiavellian thinkers like James Burnham. We want to have that kind of spectrum in Modern Age. However, I myself am actually quite on the side of what's called national conservatism now. And in fact, I was one of the speakers and one of the presidium members, one of the planners for the National Conservatism Conference that happened in DC about a month ago.
So you lean in that direction, that's right.
I lean in that direction, I think that's fair to say.
So, but you're trying to take kind of a kind of Captain Planet approach where you bring all the powers combined and you get something interesting in that combination.
You want to have, any publication needs to have an interesting conversation going on.
You don't have a monolithic feel.
Well, there's a balance to be struck. On the one hand, you want to stand for something, but you also want it to be open to challenge, open to interesting conversations, and what you stand for has to be something that you're able to bring to an audience that is not necessarily already a true believer. And I think that's one of the failings of so much of our media today, whether it's on the left or even on the right. And it's something that I've tried to avoid, both in the past when I was editor of the American Conservative magazine. I tried to bring together a very interesting conversation, a very interesting set of voices, and it's what I'm trying to do now with Modern Age as well.
So I'm trying to unpack kind of where we're at right now in the context of the broader political and cultural moment, So we've got this conservative internal fight for what does it mean to be us? What is this whole thing about? And but then you've got this larger context, and I wonder how many people who are not in the trenches of this discussion. I wonder what they think about where conservatism is going when they think of what a conservative is. Have you ever thought about how, obviously in popular media, it's Trump, Trump, Trump. This is, you're with Trump or you're against him, right? But I'm curious if that's sticking to the independents and people who are not committed to a conservative ideology but are open to it.
I'd say two things are happening. On the one hand, much of the media has the story backwards. They think Trump got elected, and how Trump got elected is mysterious, right? It's meant to be, some sort of Russian conspiracy, or it's because, Hillary Clinton was supposedly, a really bad candidate, which, by the way, nobody was saying until she lost the election. Everyone expected her not only to win, but to win big. So the media has this narrative in which they say Donald Trump won, and then suddenly you had all these unprincipled conservatives decide that they were Trump conservatives, and they started changing their views on trade and on immigration and on any number of other things. And I think the story is actually the opposite, that in fact at the grassroots level and among ordinary conservative voters, you had this sense that they had been very ill-served by the Republican establishment. And they were getting frustrated already with people like Mitt Romney and Paul Ryan and going back even to George W. Bush. And they wanted a change. And they weren't sure exactly what form that change would take. At first, it was the Tea Party, which seemed to be the real alternative to the Republican establishment, and then it became Donald Trump. But I think many of the currents you see represented by Donald Trump's administration have actually been sort of bubbling under with the American right for quite some time. You could see a little bit of that in Sarah Palin. You could see some of it in the campaigns that Mike Huckabee ran in 2008 and that Rick Santorum ran in 2012, which were populist campaigns, campaigns aimed at sort of addressing family issues, aimed at addressing working class economics. And you can certainly see a premonition of all of this if you look back to the 1990s, and you have the Pat Buchanan campaigns of 92, 96, and even 99, 2000, and also Ross Perot, who in 1992 and then to a lesser extent in 96 was also representing this idea of a kind of what's now called an America First populism, this idea that we were too engaged in foreign wars and that we weren't doing enough for America's working class and industrial base here at home. So I think actually much of this has been in the works long before Donald Trump emerged on the scene. And then the second thing I would say is that conservatives in their daily lives, especially if they're young, if they're in school, they're experiencing a kind of state of siege where they are told in the classrooms that they are bad, that they represent, sort of malign forces in the world, where if they open the newspaper, they're told that they're agents of, a foreign power, agents of Russia,
if
or something like that.
If you tweet or something, you're a bot, which is a very dehumanizing thing.
Exactly, it's precisely dehumanizing.
And it's not a one-way street, obviously. This is a nasty environment from both sides, but I don't think enough attention has been placed at how dehumanizing it is to use a language like a Russian bot if you disagree. I mean, people in the mainstream who are top analysts at the New York Times and CNN are tweeting stuff. If you see someone, I saw after the Tulsi Gabbard debate with Kamala Harris, and they said if you see people talking about this exchange, it's most likely a Russian bot. And I thought, and it said CNN and New York Times, and here we are looking at New York Times, all the news that's fit to print, and this is supposed to be the standard, right, of news journalism in America and the world in some ways. And they have that kind of flippancy about dehumanizing people with a racially charged, you can say racial or xenophobic, you are a foreign power, or you're in league with them, and we're not even sure if you're human. I mean, to me, that sends really scary alarm bells for me, because I look at things from trying to stop violence, mitigate dehumanization campaigns wherever they are. I'm not committed to being a biased ref when I see two ideologies battling in public discourse. I think there's a way to tone it down dramatically on the right as it pertains to the border issue. I think the language of invasion and stuff is not acceptable. I mean, I can understand that in a particular narrow strain related to like a vicious gang like an MS-13, but I don't think it's helpful to use that kind of loaded language, and I think it's dehumanizing. It can feel that way in the way it gets bounced around and that game of telephone that politics has in the social media world. But I don't think enough attention has been placed on the racial ugliness and the dehumanization of saying Russian bot, which has been just accepted by some of the top analysts in the trusted media,
Oh, it's true. And you're quite right to say that there is a kind of xenophobia in the way in which the elite media talks about these things and talks about, if an American is supporting Tulsi Gabbard because she's anti-war, saying, oh, that's not really anti-war, that's pro-Russia or that's pro-Assad or something like that. It's very interesting that the sort of left-wing media is highly critical of the right for its attitude towards the border, for example, but doesn't feel any kind of reflective sense of criticism about its own way of talking about identifying other Americans the elite does not like, as being tools of foreign powers and so forth.
Yeah.
And no, you're right that there's a dehumanizing that's taking place here.
And it's scary where that can lead.
It's very scary.
When it's institutionally accepted by, when it's on the papers and they're not, obviously, I don't read their articles on a regular basis, but when I see, I don't remember the gentleman's name, but it was circulated, his tweet everywhere, and he was saying, watch out, if you see, and it's not even about a conservative, it's about Tulsi Gabbard, who's very deeply leftist by most people's standards, and but just to question the narrative of warmongering, you have to be depersonalized, and you have to be dehumanized by people who are supposed to be the role models for all the news that's fit to print. It's just,
Well, you've caught on to something very important, which is that, there is a shared human psychology which, to a certain degree, is common both among the elite and among the ordinary populace, the people that the elite is often looking down upon. And there is this tendency to, to defend your group. And I don't like to call it tribalism, because it's actually many times a function not of tribal connections, but actually of the very opposite, of the kind of severing of normal human bonds,
Right.
which cause people to then try to create ideological groupings as a substitute for the natural kinds of family and community settings that they've lost.
very, very cynical, hastily put together patchwork coalitions built on warfare, right?
Built on warfare, very intellectualized, very
Yeah.
much based on, not on simply a common life, which is the foundation of sort of real, sort of human groupings, but rather on the basis of ideological polarizations.
Yeah.
And you see it among the elite just as you do among the public. And I wish the elite would be more reflective about how they themselves are guilty of many of the things they want to accuse others of.
Right. There needs to be some kind of shift that I think can dramatically start moving this in a different direction, because the temperature's too hot in a lot of different ways. So we see it manifesting in some ugly ways, in various ways in news and current events. But I think, what I'm trying to do is try to cut, Paul talks about the idea of be in the world but not of the world, right? And I like the idea of being in political, ideological worlds but not of them, and that these are all just attempts to grasp at some truth that's kind of hard to fully encompass as a human being in our limited perspective. What about, let's talk first about, Ron Paul, I think, was also an influence on what became of the Trump success, right? I mean, I've noticed that there's a tendency within conservative chatter classes to say, oh, we're past the free market stuff. That's stuff, we need to kind of move that off. And libertarianism, it was a good thing, but it's a little bit too far. Let's go get something better than this. But if you think about it, I think some of the things that made Trump so attractive were libertarian principles, kind of influenced by the campaigns of Ron Paul, with the no nation building. Why do we think that we're so exceptional that we have to judge and condemn other nations for their improprieties and human rights when we do our own things? He's literally said that in interviews. In reference to other countries like Russia and other places, like who are we to judge? We do stuff like that too, bad stuff. And that's very Ron Paul-esque. Obviously he doesn't go all the way with that, and he doesn't fully at all kind of carry that out the way I would like to see, but that anti-war strain, the distrust of the Federal Reserve, he's critiquing on a regular basis. And now with the whole the FBI and the corruption there's a kind of de facto distrust of the surveillance state that's really brewing in the Trump era of conservative talk, right, and discussion. So I see a lot of ascendancy for the best aspects and in the deregulation that he's done. So I don't really see it as a battle between establishment conservatism and Mitt Romney's and the Bushes versus this nationalist conservatism. I think it's a lot more messier than that.
It is. And the other thing that people tend to forget about with the Ron Paul campaigns is that his opposition to the idea of a North American currency union, something that would be called the Amero, that was a component of his campaigns, as was his opposition to what was being called the NAFTA superhighway, the idea that perhaps we would create a kind of, sort of massive infrastructure project, for the United States, Canada, and Mexico, all in the same basket. Basically,
and then
NATO,
skepticism of NATO.
Skepticism of NATO. The idea, Ron Paul was critical of all of these sort of transnationalist, globalist initiatives, and with Donald Trump, you see exactly the same thing. That he too is against these things. Now, we're a long way from a real project that would try to create a sort of European Union in North America by integrating, the United States,
decentralization.
Mexico.
You're saying. Okay. I see what you're saying.
I mean, it's a distant,
I was thinking of the other image model of that about states becoming more decentrally,
Yeah. Well, that's the other thing too. Is
disregarding
I think
of the
people
national-
tend to, they look at the label nationalism, and perhaps with justification, and they're afraid that nationalism necessarily means consolidation,
Right.
and that nationalism is therefore opposed to the idea of localism and opposed to the idea of states having their proper responsibilities in the federal framework.
And I get that a lot of from a writer I really enjoy, and I'm sure you do as well, Bill Kaufman, who you've published probably a lot. But he's good about that. About no, nationalism is cheap in the way it's often understood. It's cheap. It's rootless, right? We need local. We need regional. We need things that you can actually, how to get to the baseball field. You don't have to, instead of, one size fits all.
What I would say, my friend Bill, who's a brilliant literary writer, he is correct to emphasize the strengths of localism. He is sometimes mistaken, I think, and unrealistic when it comes to the relationship between localism and federalism and the relationship of federalism to nationalism. That in fact you do need a control of the borders, and that is a national concern right now, not a state concern. You do in fact need to watch out for international predatory behavior, and we certainly know that with respect to national defense. But it's also true with respect to national economic defense. That if you have a place like Beijing setting industrial policy for upstate New York or for Granite City, Illinois, that's a problem. That in fact Granite City and upstate New York, they should have industrial policy that reflects their interests, not the interests of the Chinese Communist Party. And if you're going to have an industrial policy, even a tariff policy that is protective of America against the planning of Beijing, that means you probably need to involve Washington in that, simply because, again, the states constitutionally don't have the power to determine, these international questions of trade.
But see, I'm open to this idea, but at the same time, I'm skeptical a little bit because I wonder, how much of this is we don't know how much of the decline of our industrial base is laid at the feet of government intervention into so many areas of our lives that we take for granted, and we don't connect the dots as to how that would affect industrial working class people. And so what I mean by that is I almost think that the tariff thing, I understand the idea. I understand the idea of not trying to be a purist in a world where it's totally still very much aggressive, and you can't just be just abstract ideas about free trade that are still managed trade. I understand the hypocrisy underneath the way free trade is usually marketed and pushed into discourse, but I'm a little skeptical that it's as cut and dry as the ascendant Trump nationalist argument makes it out to be, that we have to use trade barriers and things like that to correct the scales. I mean, for example, I know this is going to be a little bit left field, but I mean, on my research, what I do in my work, I see how government-protected groupthink in fields of knowledge and fields of science have greatly mutated and in many cases retarded the development of progress and innovation, which would allow for a much more vital economy that's growing and innovating in ways that we can't even fully fathom. For example, science and engineering, it's so heavily protected by competition of the Galileos, the misfits, the dissidents of physics or energy. How do you make energy? That it's so controlled because of government's funding and monopoly of the grant process and the peer review papers and the universities and how they're funded, that there's so much we don't know, and it's not connected into the immediate conversation of the factories are closing, what do we do? Let's balance the tariff deal. It's almost like a too surface of a solution, in my opinion.
You certainly have to be careful of superficiality. The 2 points I would make here, first of all, this free trade regime, which is connected to a regime of financialization. And it's something I think libertarians have been weak on in connecting what happens with the Federal Reserve and the banking system with what's also happening in our sort of trade policy.
Yeah.
I think these things are of a piece, and there's a reason why we have things like NAFTA on the one hand, while we also have this movement towards financialization and away from an industrial productive economy. So that's one concern there. The other one is that, remember, we do live in a world of governments. So while we have to be skeptical of what Washington, D.C. is doing, what our own government is doing, we should remember that simply because we are counteracting Washington, D.C. does not mean that we're necessarily counteracting all of the malevolent governments that are out there, because Beijing and any number of other states have their own sort of policies that they're pursuing, and they would like to subjugate Americans just as the most statist Democrat in Washington, D.C. would like to do.
So do you believe, as some have suggested, that the people involved in these elite financial sectors in government and these quasi-government private entities like the Federal Reserve System, that they have an ideological commitment to seeing America kind of cut down to size for the good of the globe? That's a thought that that conservatives throw.
Right, but they wouldn't phrase it that way.
But do you think they have a motivation similar to that? They want to make the world a little more fair. Let's time to kind of balance.
That they would agree with, right?
So you think it's an intentional policy of weakening America? Not that they're trying to weaken us in a diabolical sense, but let's just go ahead and make the world a little more.
What they're doing
balanced.
is they are feathering their own nests. They're sort of giving themselves as much prestige and power as they can possibly wield and more. And they're doing that by using benefits for the world as their pretext or excuse. So basically, one of the things we've seen is basically the liquidation of the privileges of American citizenship. And that's explained as being for the benefit of the third world, the developing world, when in fact, mostly it's for the benefit of our own financial elite. So
So the myth they're selling is we're trying to make the world more balanced, but in reality it's just another crony scheme.
I think that's correct,
Yeah.
yes. And, they would not say that they were unpatriotic. They would not say they really dislike America. But actually, if you look at the things they do say about, non-urban Americans, if you look at, Barack Obama saying they're bitterly clinging to their guns, if you look at Hillary Clinton describing them as deplorables, even if you look at Mitt Romney saying that 47% of the country are, addicted to government services, you can see there's a real contempt here among our leadership class for just ordinary citizens. And you can rightly imagine that these kinds of leaders are not going to be looking out for the well-being of the ordinary citizen. They're going to be looking out for the well-being of their own sort of leadership class. And then they're going to say that, well, they're still humanitarian and generous to the rest of the world because they're going to say that they're really helping out the developing countries instead of, America. But really, countries should be responsible for their own citizens. And that's what we need to get back to. And this ties in with the idea of localism. We've got to relocalize authority. We need our elites to be responsible for the well-being of Americans and America's citizenry. And then, take that further down through federalism and subsidiarity to, states have to be responsible for the well-being of the people in their states. Same with localities,
Right.
Same all the way down to families.
And I think that national conservatism, as I've looked at it, it seems to still have that impulse that's popular in the right to have a distrust for the use of central planning and power in many areas. But at the same time, they still want to mix in. It's time to, some of the things they talk about that I've heard, it sounds like kind of just corporatism on steroids, more central planning, more protection of
Well, I don't know
cartels.
anything. You'd have to tell me
Yeah.
what you have in mind by central planning. It seems to me that anything on a Leninist or a socialist model.
Well, I'm not talking
is
to
fairly.
that. But just kind of it's kind of what we still see when we look back at Bush years. The corporatism, a little bit more. That was obviously a little more globalism, but you have to have subsidies and what they're doing, for example, in the agricultural sector, where we have to beg Japan to, please, can you buy some of this soy and farm products and donate them to countries in Africa just to kind of mitigate the severe pain of all of these trade wars.
Well, hold on. So if a libertarian is going to say that the American agricultural sector...
By the way, I'm not a libertarian.
Well, no, but I'm just going to say, it's one of the things you hear libertarians say, is that, well, now we have, money going to agriculture from Washington because of, the so-called trade war. Well, it seems to me that the American agricultural sector has been drawing money from Washington, D.C.
Right.
for a long, long time. And again,
I'm not blaming this on the new Trump as if something new. I'm saying it seems like kind of warmed over justifications for continual subsidizing of these big farms that need they need to be exposed to more competition.
Look, it's not the case that the occasional half-hearted forays into libertarian policy, such as free trade, for example, or open borders, or what have you, that Washington, D.C. makes, have actually made the country more, sort of prosperous, secure, libertarian, etc. Oftentimes, what it's done is actually to introduce despair into the heartland and introduce, a sense of alienation, loneliness, being a stranger in your own country that has actually been very detrimental and destructive to the lives of thousands, if not millions, of Americans. And the idea that if you didn't have, certain policies like tariffs, that you would then have a completely libertarian America is again wrong on two grounds. First of all, because our elite may have sort of free trade and still be using that as a support for various kinds of statist activities, but also because you have foreign governments which have industrial policies of their own, and in a market that combines people across borders, which is what markets do, and that's a good thing. But when you have markets doing that, if you have one government that's setting the policies for its people, it's affecting your people as well.
Again, I'm not committed to one side of this discussion completely, in the sense that I understand the pragmatic idea of using tariffs as a kind of as an intermediary step to get these other countries to reciprocate eventually a more fair situation. We're going to punish you the hard way until you learn to work and do things the easy way, where we win-win together, or we're going to lose together for a little while, and you're going to lose more than we're going to lose. That's the kind of idea of this trade war idea. I understand the pragmatic, incremental strategy there. Let's just do this because it'll help us move towards what we want, which is a win-win, more open trade situation for both, I would assume, is kind of the idea that I've heard touted by a lot of Trump's, like Larry Kudlow. This is a means of getting to the ideal that we want to get back to. Let's just bring them to the table, let's bring them to heel, and then we'll get
I think that libertarians...
I kind of get the pragmatic idea, but...
Yeah. I think libertarians who have, a degree of skepticism towards our financial system, the privileged role of the big banks, and the Federal Reserve in particular, libertarians who are skeptical about all of these things just need to consider the extent to which there is a wider system of which they're a part. And the deindustrialization of America, the idea that we should move towards services that are pandering to the wealthy and, finance which is serving the wealthy, that this is the ideal kind of economy. I think libertarians themselves would object to that, would say that this is problematic. And if it is problematic, then you have to consider what the alternatives are and how to get there. And this is where I think there's actually common ground between national conservatives and libertarians, is that we are all critical of the way in which our economy has developed, the way in which it benefits some people but leaves many people behind, and we all want to have some adjustments to this. And in the near future, where those adjustments are going to necessarily involve various layers of government, simply because they are facts on the ground. In the long run, what kind of less, sort of government-involved system could you have? That, I think, is something to be worked out, thought about, and discussed in great depth. And I'm glad that there are people like yourself who are thinking about this in very concrete ways, but also in very principled ways. But I would just say that conversation should be ongoing. I don't think it's completely resolved that you can have...
That's what I'm trying to say, is that I'm trying to broaden the context of the conversation as well, to say, okay, if you want to challenge this fake free trade ideology of globalism that's been happening for some time now. It's been dominant. If you want to challenge that, don't just give me your pragmatic tariff solution. That's not enough for me. Let's talk with bigger, let's broaden our view here, and let's look at how these long-term baked-in areas of government picking winners and losers for scientific development has a massive downstream effect for destroying and retarding our ability to move beyond I believe we're living in an outdated dark age type situation for what we could actually accomplish if we could think outside the box and had a more competitive system for the allocation of resources to people doing the work to solve the big problems of medicine, to solve the big problems of clean energy with market solutions. They don't even have a chance to have their papers published, and no one's really talking about it, at least in a mainstream sense on the right that I'm very satisfied with. I'm trying to push this idea of this perpetual retardation of knowledge that happens when you introduce coercion into the funding of so much of how we're allowed to even talk about physics.
I think we need to remember there are various layers of coercion or distortion that can happen here. Some of it is overt direct coercion, if it's a matter of government sort of endorsing Lysenkoism or something like that in the case of the Soviet Union. But there's also a, maybe libertarians wouldn't want to call it coercion, but there's certainly an unhealthiness to an orthodoxy that becomes too encrusted. And you see that as well, where even research institutions that are not necessarily simply playing to the or dancing to the tune set by some bureaucracy that's decided on a very narrow track of funding and research. Even places that are not that determined by their funding stream may still have a very closed mind as to what kinds of things they want to investigate.
And that's the nature of groupthink, and it has it's a power that we have woefully under-researched in terms of its effect on slowing the progress of people, making solutions that work for people. It's not, people are always prone to say, like, for example, why haven't we cured cancer since the war on cancer was started with Nixon? And then the populist sentiment, if you ask the person on the street, is, oh, they're not going to let that cancer cure happen. And that's the kind of popular wisdom, but at a more fundamental level, to me, it's just a product of how powerful entrenched bureaucracies with protection from competitive pressures to shape up or ship out of the way of ideas. They can just keep rolling over with the groupthink, a narrow prism, that kind of tunnel vision that happens with institutions, and they don't have to sweat it because they don't have to worry about loss of job or loss of prestige or income, because it's a politically determined system that's monopolized, whether you're talking about the state or federal level, for issuing grants and handouts and everything to do research funding and to get those positions of power in your department. So I have a big problem with that, and I think that's something that we should talk about in this like you said, a very exciting time where we have the cement is liquid, it's soft. We can shape a new kind of conservatism or whatever you want to call it, that would be much more robust, I think, and satisfying for the people's problems that we have. I think that nationalism is not going to win in the battle between it and globalism. I think in a temporary sense it will, but I think it's going to have to give way to something more decentralized, and I don't know how that looks. I'm not sure exactly. The future is radically open, in my opinion. We're not set on one particular trajectory of cyclical repeating of the same things as some people view history, and I don't think we're set on a perfect Whig type view of progress either of history.
I would say
I think it's radically open.
Well, I have to tell you, I think the American, and I see this is actually one thing that brings together both people like Patrick Deneen on the traditionalist side of things, and also various libertarians as well. This idea of decentralization. But this American ideal of decentralization is very easy to have so long as you have the degree of security that we've had within this nation-state framework the last, almost 250 years. And it does seem to me that there's a degree of romanticism that creeps in about this, which other people can't afford. And most of world history,
other countries that don't have the
people that have had more painful historical experiences than the United States has had. And it does seem to me that, if you look at world history, you tend to have these very large aggregations of power. Empires, very large kingdoms, these things are much more, characteristic of history than periods when you have small city-states that are totally independent and that are not, sort of overawed by, a Persian Empire or by, being incorporated into, a Seleucid and a Ptolemaic Empire, or ultimately the Roman Empire. These things, or look at China, right? China has had this imperial dimension to it in terms of its scale for a very long time. Now, that's not to say that empire is inevitable or that it's good, but it does say that this is such a persistent feature in world history that when we criticize it and when we think about alternatives and ways to mitigate it, we have to be realistic.
Yeah, I totally get the pragmatic approach of nationalism as a stopgap to kind of, all right, we've got a radical, we're stuck in the mud, we can go deeper into globalism and this kind of phony market, neoliberalism or whatever people want to call it. Or we can try to reverse and go back into, a more localist approach, but I don't think we're going to be able to reverse. I'm not a romantic Jeffersonian Republican type person. I think it's something we haven't thought of yet. That's the nature of these things, especially given how exponentially culture is rapidly changing. And I think a lot of that has to do with the technology development especially communication technology with these HD, 5G phones that we're going to have soon, where you can have lightning fast, high definition capture of content anywhere in the world. It has this way of radically, in my opinion, accelerating our ability to try new weird experiments and stumble along as we go. I want to bring it to the Girardian element. I'm a fan of mimetic theory, René Girard, and I think it kind of throws an interesting twist to this whole conversation we're in. And again, this is a conversation for those who, have a little bit of background with René Girard, just for the sake of brevity. But do you see, you were talking about how market ideology, as it's popularly been practiced by conservatism and Republicans in Washington, has led to despair and alienation. And I thought about that when you said it. I said, I agree with that. But I wonder how the role of Christianity and the foundation of Christian ethics or Judeo-Christian ethics in our tradition, as imperfectly applied and worked out, obviously, as it has been in our brief history on this continent here as a country. I wonder how that plays a role as opposed to scapegoating capitalism. I think capitalism hasn't had a full good go at it in terms of being able to, obviously I'm not a protector of the ideology itself, but I am first and foremost someone who's trying to see how to live an imitation of Jesus as it relates to my neighbor in the most basic level, to say, when he says, do not resist evil with violence, these are not Hallmark card greetings. These are not wishful thinking. These are not things to be totally privatized as, if you're in a buffet line at a restaurant, you let them have the last roll when you wanted it. Those are great sentimental versions of this idea, but it's way bigger than that. It's a political thing. Turn the other cheek is a social ordering principle. It's totally political. There's a spiritual side, but it's totally political at the same time. It has an implication for how we're going to make community together, or how we're going to have our relationships worked out on a collective level. And having said that, I guess my point is, with mimetic theory in light, Girard is saying that because of the influence of Christian tradition and the Gospels, subversive, slow breakdown of strong structures of power, like empire, right? Like these big, powerful, governments in history. The cat's out of the bag in his theory. You can't go back. The more Christian concern for victims, whether people reject Christianity as a metaphysic and as a religion, we're still fully infected by the ethic and the aesthetic of Christianity. No matter how atheist or whatever we try to pretend, we're still wrestling with those feelings and those things that have been the foundation of our tradition. I don't know. I don't know if we could go back to these. I think we're in a really interesting time where governments and big powerful institutions, the more they're infected with Western values, which are this underneath, or which are above Christian ethics. I think the more you're not going to be able to have these empires.
Well, there are two interesting things happening simultaneously. On the one hand, there is a growth of Christianity in China and in East Asia in general. Now, where that will lead and whether the Chinese state will be successful in trying to repress it is an open question. And we've seen some sort of troubling developments in terms of the Roman Catholic Church forming a sort of concordat with Beijing. But the underground church in China is also growing, and there's a sense that the Chinese state has to deal with it and has to accept it because they probably can't, simply due to the Christians, what they're doing to the Uyghurs right now. So that's one development, which is, in many respects, and probably in all respects, hopeful. Mm-hmm. At the same time, there is a struggle going on in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, between Christianity and Islam. And Islam seems to be growing at a somewhat more rapid pace than Christianity. And it's troubling because this is tied in not only with population growth, which is a natural and good thing, mm-hmm. but also with coercion. Mm-hmm. And there's certainly violent strains of Islamist radicalism at work in sub-Saharan Africa, which they're contending to have the continent of the future. Mm-hmm. I mean, Africa's population growth is going to be very strong into the 22nd century, whereas almost everywhere else, including East Asia, is seeing population growth slow down and stop quite soon. So this is where some of the struggle for the world is taking place in terms of Islam versus Christianity in the developing world, and in terms of the world that's already developed, a place like China. Is this Chinese empire going to be unwound or transformed by Christianization? Or will that sort of trend of Christianization taper off at a certain point? It does seem to me that there's a danger, and you've seen it in the West, of immanentization of Christianity, of taking Christianity, secularizing it, of taking, for example, the Christian concern with sin and inverting it. So instead of being a Christian who sort of keeps an account of the things you've done that are offensive to God, and then making amends to God for doing that, instead of that Christian attitude, switching it around and saying, well, these are my sins. How can I enjoy my sins more without, feeling the guilt associated with them and without suffering the ill consequences of going out and drinking every night or going out and eating too much? And these are the things in which you see capitalism has sort of played a diabolical role in providing for people an escape route from their own sins and providing a channel other than repentance for the assuaging of the conscience. So instead of sort of going to confession, or instead of again rendering this account unto God, people will say, well, can I get a pharmaceutical product that will assuage my conscience, that will cause me to be to feel better and to lose these anxieties, which are really the result of sublimated sins. So I do worry about the sort of pharmaceutical transformation of the complex of feelings and sentiments and of guilt and sin, and turning that into something therapeutic and worldly, as opposed to something transcendental that sort of takes us out of our own worldly failings and forces us to communicate with the transcendent power.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of where there's a lot of interesting agreement with this, because that's why I don't use the word libertarian to describe my views, because I do think that capitalism, as it's popularly understood, which is kind of this corporatist system, but again, it's also used to mean just greed and go be a hustler kind of. There's a lot of words there's a lot of meanings that are very powerful that are attached and layers to that word, and I do agree that capitalism, as it's popularly understood, is something that needs to be challenged a bit. But I don't think it's the idea of free markets inherently. I think that's just a mechanism that has not been tried very well in our recent history. And so I would put more of the blame on consumerism and materialism. Ultimately, I'm going to put the blame on humans and the nature of humans to
well, that's
give
correct.
into that.
And I would emphasize, the question in part is, how one relates one's economics to
Right.
an idea of human nature.
Right.
And it's, with capitalism, it could be quite, flexible. It could be related to other forms, other understandings of
Right.
human nature that are more traditional or that are more transcendent.
That's what because in my understanding of desire, it is very illusory, right? So much of what we're desiring is external to us. We think it's in our own hearts. We think we're burning with passion for that object or that status or that social achievement in relationship to peers and so on. But it's all an illusion, and I think that's the heart of so much of Christian personal growth, right? If you're trying to follow the imitation of Jesus' role model in your life and how you relate to people, is letting go of those bad desires that you unconsciously imitate from those around you.
Absolutely.
Right?
Just so, yeah.
And so you can have that and still be pretty open to a free market, right? You don't have to have the kind of egoistic objectivism or something like front loaded into any kind of discussion about the morality of a free economic system, right? You can have a radical critique.
Absolutely, no, that's correct.
Of
Certainly,
consumerism,
you can have market freedom as part of a wholesome social order,
right?
And you can have market activity as part of a wholesome psychology.
And still have a radical critique of consumerism.
Exactly so, yeah. What I was just going to say is that what we've seen is that free market economics, even theoretical economics, has often been co-opted by utilitarianism
Right.
and by a theory of human nature which says that people are nothing other than their passions.
Right.
There is a serious argument to be made there. David Hume is a very serious thinker. When he says that, a reason is the slave of the passions, that's not something to be dismissed out of hand simply because it leads to some very uncomfortable conclusions.
Mm-hmm.
Nevertheless, I think this is where returning to a religious perspective
Right.
on the transcendent and the idea that there really is something more to humanity than simply whatever our impulses and passions tell us is essential. So you can have, and that's the key thing, is not to reduce all of life to a single dimension,
Right.
A single dimension of fulfilling, preferences or something like that, which is to use the language of economics,
Right.
but rather to have a multidimensional social and political and economic life, something that brings into communication this, passionate side of humanity with the rational side and with the revealed side as well, that these things can't be reduced to one another.
When Jesus says God desires mercy, not sacrifice, and he kind of uses that as go and learn what this means if you want to understand what this is all about, what I'm trying to model for you. I take that into the realm of places like the execution of so much of the laws that we kind of assume are not violent or coercive. We just assume it's okay to have, minimum wage laws, but what about the person who's, again, that misfit is who I'm concerned with, because that's humanity. Humanity has misfits in all shapes and sizes and private misfit ways that we don't even disclose, that we all have our nuances and idiosyncratic ideas and personal, dreams and ways of doing things. But the idea of kind of unmasking the violence at the heart of so much of kind of banal laws, like, selling raw milk is a crime in many places, and minimum wage law. I think it's a good. I take the principle of do not resist evil in a violent way that Jesus says, and I say, you could talk to your friend and say, I think it's kind of evil that you're paying your employees in such a stingy way or whatever. That's evil. Come on, let's work on that. But you don't get to pull a gun to him with your friends and say, hey, I don't have time to talk to you. I'm a Christian, but I do that on Sunday. It's time to use the force of the law to say, we've decreed that you need to pay $16. And if you pay $1 less and you protest that as a conscientious objector because you intend to use your extra profits to invest in Haiti and not in an increase in wages, that's your choice. Let people work their salvation out with fear and trembling. I think there's a radical freedom within the Christian way of doing community that still requires a strong and very powerful moral challenge for your own discipline of your desires. Does that make sense?
It makes sense.
It's this idea that there's a radical freedom in the way we should treat our neighbor, but that doesn't mean a kind of libertinism for yourself.
That's
and
right.
I think that gets really mixed up in conversations. It's like oftentimes people will say, you're a Christian and you're for, getting rid of these laws and teaching people to use their power as a jury member to nullify the use of violent coercion to challenge nonviolent vices and problems. They can't understand that, but I can't understand how that's not more intuitively felt in our communities. When you read the stories of Jesus, it's right off the page. And so I guess my point and my challenge as we kind of land the plane here is, I think we need to talk more, and I think you're doing that, and what you're doing. We need to talk more about how to, if we're big about the West, what made the West special, and what is that standard? And I think it's found in the imitation of the person of Jesus, whether you're religious or not. If you want to be true to the Western, obviously there's more influences than that, but there's no question that there's one person in history who's had an outsized impact on the identity that's so unique to the West. And I think if we don't recover that radical mercy-driven ethic that Jesus provides, if we imitate his example in our way of doing politics, we're going to continue to have despair and alienation, no matter what nationalistic fixes come along to correct some of the indulgences of the past conservative ink.
Well, you're exactly right that you can't, save souls through the power of government. And you're correct as well that a civilization includes a religious element, and in fact, the religious element is the heart of the civilization. And in practical terms, everywhere you look, where you see a rise of various kinds of nationalism, right now in the world, you see that they are closely tied in with religious traditions of their civilizations. So in India, you have the BJP party, you have Modi, who has, of course, this Hindu element to his nationalism. In Israel, you see that the governing coalition, until just recently, and Netanyahu's kind of gotten himself into some difficulties here, but the governing coalition has been basically the nationalist conservatives along with the ultra-Orthodox and with the Orthodox in general. You see this in a place like Russia, where Vladimir Putin clearly sees a need to provide honor to the Orthodox Church as a bulwark of his own power. That if Putin were to try to do this as a pure secularist, his power would be endangered. He needs to have that connection to something that's larger than himself, or else he is going to be swept away. Now, in these different places, we see these things playing out in better and worse ways. Simply to see the phenomenon is not to necessarily approve of the way it plays out in each place. Here in the West, we have this fundamental question of what is the Western religion? It is Christianity, but clearly Christianity can mean many things. What does it mean to say Western Christianity? What does it mean to say a religion of the West? And it has to do with this Augustinian tradition, which is, I think, somewhat distinguishes the form of Christianity that has prevailed in the West from the form that you might find in the Orthodox churches to the east, or in Ethiopia, for example. It has to do with this weird combination of Catholic elements, Protestant elements, and also what have been called Socinian elements that you find in John Locke and others, which have a tendency towards secularization. But in all of these things, the Western religious tradition, it's fascinating, first of all. It's something in which there's always something new to be discovered, something new to be learned. And second of all, it is absolutely essential to recover if we're going to not simply be subjects of power, if we're not simply going to be made into objects for the crafting and destruction of these great forces in the world, economic forces, political forces, states, corporations, etc.
I think it has something to do with personalism or this idea of seeing the human person for what it's endowed with intrinsically. A friend of mine, David Bentley Hart, the theologian, he's not someone who would call himself conservative. We've had a discussion or two ourselves, and has a lot of criticism towards Trump, but I still see a lot of common ground in these talks, because he's good at pointing out about the radical nature of the passage in the Gospels where after Peter has betrayed Jesus, 3 times, and he sees the cock crow as the prediction was made. as the kind of indicator of what he would do when he was in his zeal. He had a zeal that, no, I'm gonna stay true to you. I will not go with the crowd. I will not lose my personhood in this amorphous blob of passion and anger and mindlessness that we all have a tendency to fall into. And it's such a perfect encapsulation of humanity right there in that story, that all of us are Peter, and the way it's hard to stand up and have courage against the crowd. It's hard to snap out of that bystander effect in so many ways, politically and personally in our own lives. But the beautiful thing that David Bentley Hart points out is how the gospel has such a radical attention to the internal and emotional state of a peasant fisherman in that time, where it notes that Peter weeps. And we having 2,000 years in between us to that story, we do not understand how radical that recovery of his personhood is in the context of that moment in history, in which the concerns of someone who was very low on the hierarchy for the world's hierarchical structures around the world, pretty much, that the narrator would focus in on his agony of having betrayed his friend and the person he loved. And that, I think, is a kernel, a taste of the West, that the best of what the West has tried to do and others around the world have done in their own way, in their own cultures. That's why we built hospitals and said, come whoever you are. It's not about ethnicity or family lineage. You're sick, come in. Now, that can be perverted through the coercive nature of this social justice and leftism, where it's, all right, let's put that in through force. But if the conservative conversation can imbue itself with that concern for the least of these, and leaven its tough, we're the place for facts and logic, leaven that, and have a tenderness for the emotional state of people that are not seen, and a love for the neighbor, and how our laws impact them on a harm basis. I think we'd be onto something,
Well, I totally agree. And in fact, one of the great things that's been happening right now is that, African Americans are doing better today than they had been doing in the recent past. That, unemployment among African Americans has dropped to, a 50-year low. And we're seeing some movement on criminal justice reform that is going to be very helpful to families that have been ripped apart as family members have been sent to prison for very long terms. And of course, all of this has to be looked at very carefully with respect to criminal justice reform. You have to have the justice and the criminal elements. You have to have mercy, yes, but you also have to have...
My principle is no victim, no crime. And I know that's it gets tough on some issues. People get nuanced about it, but no victim, no crime. Please present the injured party if you want to put someone in a cage. A cage is a place for violent people. I think we're performatively bearing false witness against our neighbor when we put them in a cage with violent people for a non-violent action.
I agree with you, but I would say that, as a Christian, one should not reduce everything simply to the dimension of violence.
It's not the only thing, of
violence
course.
in
Right.
the sort of
in
most
a physical
overt
way,
form.
right?
That one has to think about because it used to be that violence was understood as anything that compels something to go against its nature.
Right.
And we have had a progressive transformation of the concept of nature away from older sort of Christian and Aristotelian understandings toward a modern materialistic understanding of nature. And as that has happened, the idea of what force and coercion are has also been narrowed to a point where now it is something that...
kind of more robotic and not more...
Now, that said, even taking the idea that there may be things which are harmful in ways that are not necessarily a direct expression of coercion, like beating someone up or punching him, even so, one has to, I think, bring into consideration some of the elements that you've mentioned. The idea that putting someone, in a box with violent offenders
for a non-violent
is that helping that person? Is that helping society?
And is it? But think about it. Is it performing a lie? Because the idea of confining someone to a cage, to me, is an extrapolation of the personal moral right you have. That if you see someone doing something violent, you have the right to physically restrain them. and get them off of if they're attacking an elderly person in the park. You have the right, if you can, to physically restrain them and keep them confined if they're trying to hurt someone. So then you can extrapolate that because it's moral for me to use defensive force for the protection or defense of victims from force on a personal level, then I can then extend that collectively as a shared rule that if you are found to do violence or fraud or harming children, you can't sell a child an AK-47. I mean, that's a violent act because they don't have the faculties to even begin to understand
right.
that. So I would say, is that really something we should look at? Is how the sausage of lawmaking actually looks on a personal level?
Well, that personal level is very important, right?
Reduce it, and then see if it actually makes
sense. You should not lose track of human beings. One of the dangers I think that we, as a civilization, have fallen into is technocracy and the idea that we have this sort of perfect map of knowledge, and that we can therefore treat people as if they are objects rather than sort of persons in their own right. Because we understand, what their motives are, we understand what controls them, and we understand, sort of how they can be, and both for good and for ill, right? That we can somehow apply a formula in order to turn someone from a criminal into a virtuous citizen. Yeah. And there's nothing like that that's possible. That in fact, all of this has to be done at the personal level. It has to be done by reaching an individual soul. Mm-hmm. And there are obviously sort of broad policies that a civilization at any level, whether it's a nation or a community, must enforce. Mm-hmm. But in terms of actually changing people, that's something that is not can't be done robotically, can't be done mathematically.
It has to deal with skin in the game, which is something that has to be in relationship. And you can't.
That's right. It has to be.
And relationship is inherently not a part of the justice system for dealing with all these thousands of nonviolent regulations and people getting fined and imprisoned for not having a food license to sell tamales out of their kitchen. I think if conservatives, or whatever we're going to call these labels, if they would have a conversation about that with the defense of the individual, the person, not in individualism, but in a Christian care for the person against the collective, and its need to scapegoat people who violate these little rites of passage that they set up for occupational licensing. I mean, I've had a person on my program where he was, they were imprisoned for braiding without a license. This kind of violent nature is something that I think conservatives would do wonders for their movement to take on as a mantle.
Well, I think you're seeing not necessarily conservative organizations in every case, but groups like the Institute for Justice going to the courts to defend the rights of people to braid hair, for example, without a license. It's obvious that we have, excessive licensing regulations right now in this country, and a lot of those are local restrictions. A lot of those are not, Uncle Sam saying you can't do this. A lot of them are local governments and states that have been captured by, sort of the interests of local businesses, which have said, hey, we want to protect our own sort of market share, and therefore we're going to insist that, the state of Colorado or whatever have this sort of protection for people who want to do manicures, people who want to do, hairdressing or what have you. Now, all of that said, we also, there's this tendency to think of things at, again, this kind of level of coercion as it's understood within liberalism, to understand things in terms of the individual and what's happening to him or her. I think we also need to think, however, about these relationships that individuals have, because that's what a community is. A community is a network of relationships between persons. Mm-hmm. But because it's a network, it is a thing unto itself. It's not simply a mathematical aggregate of isolated atoms. It really is something where the relationship between those different components is what gives the whole its character. And the defense of the character of wholes, of interrelationships, is very important. Mm-hmm. And to a liberal, when you defend those kinds of relationships, it looks as if what you're doing is coercive. Right. And I would say, as a conservative and as a critic of the excesses of liberalism, that in fact that is not coercion. So take, for example, marriage. Right. Liberalism has always been on the side of very free elements, a very free approach to divorce. Mm-hmm. Now, actually, at the very beginning, someone like John Locke didn't have that totally free approach. He said that as long as they were children, you should in fact keep the marital unit together, and that you could only have free divorce later on after the children were grown up. This has now gone very far, however. You've had liberalism take it to the point where not only is divorce readily available, but even as a marriage exists, it is as if they were just two individuals cohabitating in a shared building. That the idea of a marriage as an entity has gone out of the window, and instead it's simply yet another temporary contract between two totally atomistic individuals. I think if you had restrictions on this, if you did not have, as free divorce, that would not be a limitation upon persons. That would in fact be a protection of the relationships that persons enter into quite voluntarily in order to have a marriage in the first place. So liberalism often uses the language of non-coercion to in fact force people into social structures that are inhuman and that are damaging to them.
And I think it's romantic individualism, this notion of pursuing, what feels good for you and your true ideal, and that means, your passions change on a whim in marriage, and therefore there's there's a deification of the individual in the romantic individualistic.
But it's not just that; it's also the demonization of the unit. It's a demonization of the community, of the marriage.
And I think it's something that can be done, but that can be talked about. But I think the church and the Christian community needs to learn how to become a public voice without having to marry it to a political program.
I agree with that wholeheartedly.
And that's a whole. It's like the only way Christians can engage the public square is you've got a private space or get involved in politics. There's another way of having a public square conversation that we should be bold and vigorous in defending these values.
And in fact, that's where so much of the difficulty that people of all kinds are facing right now is taking place. It's not necessarily just on the level of government. It's not necessarily just on the level of the private sphere. It's rather within the kind of shared conversational sphere, within the shared sphere of social life that is not simply a matter of government policy. It's a matter of human relationships. And we've neglected that, and we've let certain powers and influences creep into that sphere, that social sphere, without consciously thinking of what they're doing. And we see this in our communications media, for example, that the way in which people can be demonized, whether on the left or on the right, the way in which any idea that is not approved of by the elite in the educational world and in the media is sidelined and ridiculed. All of this has been very damaging. We need to get back to a sense that human beings can form societies and defend those societies without being co-opted into either totally privatized or else turned into state power and the crudest form of coercion.
You've been at this work for a long time, a long endeavor, and a lifelong passion for this. What's your highest hope for your endeavors that you can contribute to?
Individually, or in terms of just how I'd like to see
What's your highest hope of what you would like to see in the way
my highest hope is to clarify what's actually happening in the world, and to provide in many ways it's more perhaps of an educational role even than it is a journalistic one. But I really want people to understand the consequences of philosophy for ordinary life, and vice versa. I also want them to understand the dignity of ordinary life and the need to protect that, the need to protect just ordinary, sort of family and community and just the existence you have as a person who is comfortable in your own skin. The need to protect all of that against ideological forces and other powers that would like to come in and transform everything into raw materials or commodities or mere sort of objects for the application of power. So there's a philosophical tale to be told here. There's a tale of politics in terms of what's happening in America, and there's a tale of history as well. And all of this seems to me, this narrative, this discourse, this great sort of understanding of our world has been distorted to a tremendous degree by institutions which have been, in some cases, just short-sighted. And they're pursuing very narrow understandings, as we see in the academy. You've talked about research paths in science, which have been dictated by convention, by an excessively an excessive degree of groupthink, right? Or by government funding, which has said, research this, don't research that. And you see that in the humanities as well.
And they don't know what they don't know. That's the thing. They don't
exactly.
know.
And you see that in the humanities as well, where basically our understanding of history, our understanding of philosophy, all of these things have been turned into non-public discussions. They've been turned into sort of private gardens for small sets of experts who have ideological biases and have therefore sort of cut the public off from its rich patrimony of civilization And I see my sort of life's mission as being to break that down, to let the public have access once again to the commons, the civilizational commons of our patrimony.
So we're in wild times, and the tasks and challenges are great. So how do you feel?
I actually feel very optimistic.
Good.
And, I remember the situation 15 years ago where the things we're talking about were all sidelined. They were not part of the conversation. You couldn't talk about, the idea of localism against, sort of the war on terror of the time. You couldn't talk about the idea of sort of what we need as...
Corrupt police at the top of FBI? I mean, that's a huge...
That's right. You had this concentration of power that was wedded to this ethos of consumerism as well. Remember, when George W. Bush came and spoke after 9/11, he said, go out and spend. You had these car companies, that were taking the, sort of brave words that had been, spoken on that plane over Pennsylvania, let's roll, and turned that into a slogan for let's buy a new car, let's roll.
Yes.
All of this had been combined in a way that seemed to make the idea of, a humanity that is not wrapped up in this kind of end of history, final conflict to export democracy and markets and so forth. It had been the worst parody of Francis Fukuyama's world was the one we were living in 2003. And all that's gone now. Now I think you have a return to reality and a return to the human person in many respects.
Right. So we're in exciting times. There's a lot of opportunity, a lot of potential risk too.
Yeah.
But that makes it exciting, doesn't it?
That's life, and that's how it should be, yes.
Well, thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.
And thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Well, that was fun, huh?
Yeah.